Hello again, and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Wednesday, the 24th of August. I'm Andrew Wilson, and this is Scotland at 7. This evening, I have the latest daily update from Ukraine on day 182 of the illegal Russian war of aggression. And then I'll introduce this evening's guest, and then together we will look at today's headlines from Scotland and around the world. The Russian opposition politician Yevgeny Roisman was shown being detained at his home in a video published on social media late earlier today. The video of the arrest showed Roisman, former mayor of the Ural city of Yekaterinburg, being taken away by law enforcement officials. Pope Francis has called for concrete steps to end the war in Ukraine and avert the risk of a nuclear disaster at the Zaporizhia power plant. The IAEA, the UN nuclear watchdog, said yesterday it would visit the Russian-occupied plant in Ukraine within days if talks to gain access succeeded. Norway and the UK will jointly supply micro-drones to Ukraine to aid its war with Russia. The cost of the Teledyne FLIR Black Hornet drones, used for reconnaissance and target identification, will be up to 90 million Norwegian crowns. That's about £7.5 million, the Norwegian Defence Ministry said in a statement. President Volodymyr Zelensky told Ukrainians today in an emotional speech to mark 31 years of independence that Ukraine was reborn when Russia invaded and would recapture annexed Crimea and occupied areas in the east. In the recorded speech aired on the 6-month anniversary of Russia's 24th of February invasion, Zelensky said Ukraine no longer saw the war ending when there was peace, but when Kyiv was actually victorious. Many civilians were attempting to leave Kyiv amid fears of a Russian attack, according to an advisor to Ukraine's president, Alex Rodnyansky. He said that people were worried that there was certainly some concern an attack may strike the centres of decision-making on Wednesday. President Zelensky has warned Russia of a strong response to any Independence Day attacks. Russia will receive a powerful response, he said. President Zelensky also said Ukraine will not agree to any proposal to freeze the current front lines in order to calm Moscow, which controls about 22% of Ukraine, including Crimea. At the point where we are not ready for a ceasefire, he said. Zelensky also vowed to return Crimea to Ukraine, saying it would become part of the EU along with the rest of the country. The UN nuclear watchdog said it would visit the Russian-occupied Zaporizhia nuclear power plant in Ukraine within the next few days if ongoing negotiations succeed. The US is set to announce a fresh security assistance package for Ukraine of about $3 billion to equip it for a war of attrition and secure its medium to long-term defence posture. And hundreds of people gathered in Moscow for the funeral of Daria Dugina. Dugina, the daughter of the ultra-nationalist Alexander Dugin, was killed on Saturday in a car bomb attack outside Moscow. Now, we are lucky enough to be joined this evening by Dr. Alan Flowers. Alan has dedicated much of his academic career to working on educational initiatives and research projects examining the widespread impact of the 1986 Chernobyl explosion. He worked closely with academics from Belarus in the immediate years after the disaster, and more recently collaborated with experts from Ukraine. He has led the academic cooperation between Kingston University in London and what later became the International Sakharov Environmental Institute in Minsk. In 2002, this university awarded him an honorary doctorate in radio ecology. In 2004, Alan was placed on the Belarusian KGB's forbidden persons list and banned from entering the country. In any event, he is now the current chair of the Anglo-Belarusian Society. Alan, how are you keeping, and how's the Northwest Highlands this evening?
Absolutely wonderful, and it's great to be enjoying the fresh air of Kinlochbervie, which is behind me here. Although normally on the 24th of August I would be in Kiev, I'd be on Krещатик, and I would be celebrating with my many Ukrainian colleagues and friends, but somewhere in the background here there is a Ukrainian flag. There's certainly one flying proudly today in Kinlochbervie up here in the northwest.
Thanks, Alan. It's particularly important and particularly special that you're able to join us on this important day. So we're extremely grateful to you. And your point about the Ukrainian flag is a good one. As I've been travelling around Scotland a little bit, I've been pleased and surprised to see the Ukrainian flag flying pretty regularly, including at shots on the M8, a very large flag there. But let's start with this evening's news because air raid sirens sounded across Ukrainian controlled territory as the country marked 6 months since Moscow's invasion, on a somber Independence Day overshadowed by warnings of brutal attacks. The US is expected to announce a further $3 billion in much needed aid, and senior politicians from across Europe travelled to Kyiv to show their support in person, despite security warnings, including a US call for its citizens to leave the country. It's 31 years since Ukraine declared its independence from the Soviet Union, and 6 months to the day since Russia launched a war that aimed to reverse that step away from Moscow's control. Many in the capital on Wednesday were taking stock of both their achievements and their losses. Few outside Ukraine, even amongst its allies, expected the country to hold off Russia's army so effectively, including in a decisive victory outside Kyiv. But the country has paid a terrible human price for its successes so far. Thousands of civilians have been killed since the war began on the 24th of February, while Ukraine has acknowledged 9,000 military deaths. Millions have lost their homes or have been forced into exile, and there is little hope that there is an end to the fighting in sight. Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelensky told his fellow citizens that their country was reborn when Russia invaded in a speech recorded on the steps of the capital's monument to independence and aired on the morning of the anniversary. So, Alan, firstly, the anniversary today falls exactly 6 months after Russia sent tens of thousands of troops into Ukraine. And in his emotional speech to his compatriots, Zelensky said that Russia's attack had revived the nation's spirit. He said a new nation appeared in the world on February the 24th at 4 in the morning. He said it was not born but reborn, a nation that did not cry, scream, or take fright, one that did not flee but did not give up and did not forget. So I understand, of course, the emotional flourishes in his speech today on Independence Day and speaking to a country which is at war with Russia. But do you think is what we heard from President Zelensky today, is it reflected at all in what you're hearing from other Ukrainians?
Oh, absolutely. And what I heard from day one, which anybody with close friends in Ukraine will never remember that night. I was working actually through the night and heard the Putin speech, and the reaction across the board. I've got colleagues who many really were questioning some of the political actions of President Zelensky, but the rapidity with which unity spread right across all aspects of the political spectrum in Ukraine. That was really from day one, the 24th, 25th, a national emergency. And that is the great thing about Ukrainians. It's something that Ukrainian leaders have indeed always recognized, that by and large, there is very much a Ukrainian nation that Ukrainians will rally round. They might have political differences, but that's why Zelensky did feel this rebirth, this new form of unification that threw away the political boundaries, and we feel this from Kharkiv to Odessa, from Lviv to Dnipro. The free areas of Ukraine are hugely unified. There's just this absolute strength of focused purpose. And what they realize is that 24th of August back in 1991, that may have been the start of an independence period, but what they realize is that this will secure a victory. The solution to this war will secure for all Ukrainians a long-term independence future, a real secure independence, which has not been there in recent decades. So that very much is creating this unity that we see.
Thanks, Alan. That's interesting. You talk there about unity, and you talk about a shared sense of purpose, and also an aspiration or a target or a purpose in terms of seeking to secure the long-term independence of Ukraine. And now those are obviously key aspects of the response that we've seen from Ukraine and from Ukrainian people. Are there any, what else do you see perhaps as being the key components of Ukraine's successes so far? In the context that, as I mentioned, back in February, I don't think many people expected that Ukraine would still be would be in the position that it is in today.
Well, those who knew Ukrainians before the 24th of February knew the immense creativity, freedom of thinking, energy, purpose. And this is actually what we saw in the way Ukrainians fought the initial advances into their country. And in fact, those that were supplying weapons, you may recollect that Britain was in the forefront of supplying the anti-tank weapons, the rocket launchers that did such an amazing job in stopping the heavy armored advance onto Kiev. But what was recognized is it wasn't just having the weaponry, it was the intelligent way, imaginative way that Ukrainians deployed this. Now, Ukrainians have been throwing off Soviet system and approaches for 30 years. And this is one example where Ukrainians will fight a war, will have an army that is much closer to the style of a Western army, where you have thinking and independently acting of officers and army personnel. The Soviet top-down, highly controlled, nobody does anything unless the command comes through. That was thrown away. You had these small independent groups fighting incredibly intelligently, incredibly creatively with the weapons that they had. So there really was a difference in approach, and that's led that Ukrainian style of fighting a war. It surprised so many people that they had such success in these early weeks, and there's more to come. And of course, as it's widespread public knowledge, there is a lot of training in progress and preparation for the next phase, and that's a tremendous investment, because the Ukrainian troops that are preparing for the next stage will undeniably they've proved their ability to very intelligently use the resources applied, and not surprisingly, that's why they're deserving so much support from freedom-loving democratic countries.
Absolutely, thank you, Alan. And it's a good point that you make there with regard. Now, I'm no military analyst. However, we've heard from time to time during the last 6 months of the importance in Western armies, in particular, of reliance, as you say, upon sergeants who are trained very highly and are and authority is delegated to them to fight in the most appropriate way in the circumstances that they find themselves, in sharp contrast to the command and control approach that we see perhaps from the less reformed Russian army at the moment. But thinking about weapons for a moment, I will talk to you about the next phases in a moment. But thinking, first of all, I've been told today that President Joe Biden has announced nearly $3 billion further dollars for weapons and equipment in Washington's biggest tranche of security assistance to date. And your former fellow student, Mr. Johnson, was also in Kyiv promising some weapons as well. But I'm not thinking about Biden or Johnson for the moment. I'm interested to talk to you in broader terms. Do you think that is the military buildup, which is continuing and is supported by governments who are members of NATO, is that going to become a problem or a growing problem for President Putin as pressure to succeed builds on Moscow?
Well, the problem we have is that we've already had the Soviet-style army, the Russian army book, thrown at Ukraine. The artillery far back, pummeling cities, the sort of approaches in Chechnya, the approaches used in Syria, and because of the intelligence of fighting and the sense in knowing when to give ground, For quite a period, the Ukrainians have had to hold out, taking that pummeling. Now, if now the war is taken to these rearguard areas and will damage the heavy weapons that have been firing onto the Ukrainian positions, it's quite clear we're going to see a turning of the tide in a new phase. Now, quite the debate that then ensues as to, well, what happens when Mr. Putin realizes his troops are having to give ground and occupied territory is being ceded? That's when matters again would enter a very dangerous and unknown phase. So, but this is an inevitable step. I mean, it's quite clear Ukraine is not going to tolerate this a stalemate position. It's been made quite clear the current Ukrainian position, and the West supports that it's Ukrainians who have to decide what the terms of peace will be. And countless times, and again reiterated today, is that it has to be a peace that restores fully Ukrainian independence over the territory that they held with the internationally agreed borders of 2014. So we have to remind our viewers here that that very much does include Crimea, which was occupied in 2014, and Donbass and Lugansk. Those are not permanent Ukraine watchers and colleagues of Ukrainians on a year-by-year basis may well have, it's easy to forget, may well have forgotten that this all started back in 2014 with a major land grab that many might say the West did not respond to fast enough. But the West is now responding, the assistance is there, and it's quite clear the strategic aim of the Ukrainian government is to have a fully independent Ukraine with the land borders of 2014.
Yes, of course, Alan. Thank you. Now, you were talking there about dangerous phases in the conflict. And of course, in southern Ukraine, both sides have accused the other of firing missiles and artillery at the Russian-occupied Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, raising fears of a nuclear catastrophe. The UN nuclear watchdog, as I've said, has said it hopes to gain access soon, whilst at the same time, I think it's reported today that Russia has arrested 2 Ukrainian employees at the plant for allegedly passing information to Ukrainian authorities, who I presume are their employers. But that's not the question here. What I wanted to talk to you a little bit about was to understand a little bit more, because we've heard a great deal about the nuclear power plant at Zaporizhia, reported as the largest nuclear power plant in Europe. We've heard a great deal over the last few days. Is it possible, could you maybe tell us a little bit more about this nuclear facility that we've heard so much about recently? For example, can you compare it in size to the facility at Chernobyl?
Well, yes, it's a very different type of reactor. What Zaporizhia is a more modern type, a bit closer to the very safe, well-managed reactor we have at Sizewell that uses pressurized water. There isn't a horrible mix of graphite, some solids and liquids that could cause the type of explosions, and is of an absolutely completely different design. So what we can be sure of is we won't get a Chernobyl type process, and the control and safety systems on these reactors, which we have to remember they are still being operationally managed. The people throwing the switches and if told you've got to do a shutdown, the people who are doing the shutdown are people who know that plant very well. These are the full-time, long-term technicians, the reactor operators that have been working there for many years. So we don't need to fear that in engineering and technical terms, the experienced people are there, they're on the plant. The only question is about A, what they're being told to do, and B, the extent to which they can carry out their maintenance program, and also the extent to which they can communicate and do their reporting. It's right. It's large, because I seem to recollect there are 6 very large. It's a sort of Russian Soviet style. It's a design that came out of the Soviet period. VVERs. They're pressurized water type reactors, and yes, there's a comparable one in the north of France. At Gravelines with 6 large reactors, but each reactor doesn't quite have the same power. So it's a large facility because there are a number of several nuclear reactors on the site, all of a modern type, all meeting international safety standards. And I watched with great interest. It's a shame the media didn't focus so much on the United Nations meeting that took place yesterday about the Zaporizhia plant, where the United Nations Security Council, each member of the Security Council in turn, made some statements about that. And apart from, I saw a little bit of equivocation and vagueness with Brazil and China, but it was very noticeable that nobody was really suggesting, except Russia, anything else other than the fact there was a Ukrainian issue in all this. And also the call that the International Atomic Energy Inspector should get in there, because they do need to know what's going on, and they do need to be able to review and hear what potential maintenance issues as well as staffing issues there are. And one of the problems has been exactly what we heard, this crazy issue about communication. I mean, there's two Ukrainians whose job it is to communicate with Kiev. What are we doing getting them arrested for communicating? It makes you wonder, what were they communicating? The Russians didn't want communicated. So concerns, we're not going to see a Chernobyl, but what there is a risk of seeing is modest, localized. There's always a potential. There's mechanics there. There's materials that could create some leaks, something unexpected. But the normal shutdown and safety systems, as far as we know, these are all operable. The real concern is that you just get some crazy misguided missile that's going to start blowing bits apart and creating a localized, it would be in the area, and that's in nobody's interest. Firstly, it's not in Russia's and not Ukraine's interest to destroy a really important electricity generating plant. I mean, in Scotland, we've got a very good running nuclear reactor at Torness. Now, Torness can supply half of Scotland's electricity easily in the summertime. So superb plant. And we're talking about a site that's essentially 3 times Torness's. So that can give a very major contribution to Ukraine, a country of 40 million, 8 times Scotland. So it's significant resource. There are Russians, of course, we're talking about them possibly redirecting through power grid electricity to Crimea, and they've got an interest in supplies to the south. So it's in everybody's interest to keep that plant operating, but under the normal international safety processes. So it was right that the United Nations Security Council, not exactly unanimously, because Russia is sitting in there, but there was a call right across the Security Council to get these inspectors in with the support and joint assistance of Russia and Ukraine working together. And let's hope they can work together on this as they did with the grain issue in Odessa. It was proved that when there's mutual interest, they'll work together.
That's a very good point that you make, Alan. And now you mentioned the UN Security Council meeting yesterday and the statements we've seen from the IAEA about their wish to be present at the plant and to inspect. Now, without being glib for a moment, it shows my age. I'm reminded of John Travolta in the movie Broken Arrow when his exasperated character instructs his fellow conspirators, "Would you mind not shooting at the thermonuclear weapons?" Now, that's a very glib approach to it. However, in terms of the IAEA and the United Nations and European nations more generally, what should we be doing to properly protect this facility in addition to not shelling it?
Well, there has to be a continual supply and topping up of any equipment required for maintenance. And this is the worry, that the supply routes are perhaps not there, and also the communication routes, if there is a need to refer or report any issues through the normal reporting guidelines to the International Atomic Energy Authority. There is a a big international network of nuclear experts. There's an organization called the World Association of Nuclear Operators. Everybody's meant to be, and does in normal working circumstances, help everyone else. So much of the concern is about the unknown and what would happen if something unexpected did happen. Would the operators have the communication, the facilities, and the equipment? So what needs to be done is reopen the standard communication channels to allow the Ukrainians to report without fear of arrest. And really, the call that there should be a demilitarized area, that was very clear at the United Nations yesterday. And really, the main call is that Russia should return this plant to its normal operating management system. That means that not just having the technicians, the engineers there following Russian instructions, they really should. This is Ukrainian plant, Ukrainian territory. It should be being managed through the standard communication channels of the Ukrainian government and their Ministry of Energy. So what can the West do? I mean, the statements, the pathway, the tactical approach, it was all laid out at the United Nations yesterday, which I've briefly stated. And it is clear that there is not quite so much military activity there. And obviously, Ukrainians have to be seen visibly to be holding off. I was taken by the call for the Russians to inspect the satellite imagery of the plant, and that's something I haven't seen and been able to check on more recently. But they do seem to be stating that there's not quite the extent of military hardware in that area than has been reported. So there's a greater clarity, and the inspection, of course, would get it clearer what was going on that plant. Is it being used essentially as a military base? It's totally unacceptable. A nuclear plant should be used as a shield to stop Ukrainians shelling it, and that it be used as a military base. And it's that's an area. What sanctions can you possibly apply to Russia if they start playing that sort of game?
Absolutely, Alan. Thank you. I suspect that I hope that you and I in the future are able to come back both to the way in which the role in which nuclear weapons and nuclear power, so civilian and military nuclear facilities, have played in the way in which this war has unfolded. However, whilst it's been fantastic to have you this evening to talk about the events from Ukraine and in particular Zaporizhia, let's move on a little bit just now. We'll come back to Scotland. We'll come back to Scotland, come back to Scottish politics and Scottish economics, because the government expenditure and revenue Scotland figures, GERS, the 2021-22 statistics show that Scotland's deficit fell by 10.3%, compared to a drop of 8.4% for the UK. Revenue rose to £73.8 billion, up a record £11.1 billion from the previous year, while public spending fell by almost £1 billion to £97.5 billion. The Deputy First Minister, John Swinney, said, "Today's figures show Scotland's fiscal position is recovering faster than the UK's, with a huge fall in the annual deficit thanks to the largest increase in revenues on record." This is before the full impact of the rise in oil prices that we've seen more recently, which is likely to see Scotland's deficit fall faster than the UK's again next year, with oil and gas revenue set to grow by £13 billion this year. He continued, "The figures also highlight how the UK's response to the cost of living crisis is being built on Scotland's natural resources, not least with its windfall tax on the North Sea." But even without North Sea receipts, he continued, the record revenue generated was sufficient to cover all day-to-day devolved spending, as well as all social security spending in Scotland, including the state's pension. GERS describes Scotland's current fiscal position under the current constitutional arrangements, with 74% of revenue and 37% of spending reserved to the UK government. And we know Scotland's economy is already suffering as a result of austerity and Brexit. In the first full financial year since Brexit, the JERS figures show the economic harm of leaving the EU is driving up borrowing in the UK and contributing to the UK deficit being one of the largest in Europe. Finally, he said, even in the midst of an energy crisis, the UK as a whole is benefiting from Scotland's natural wealth, which is why Scotland can expect its deficit to fall further in the future. So, Alan, the Deputy First Minister, John Swinney, said JERS describes Scotland's current fiscal position under the current constitutional arrangements, and he said that in the first full financial year since Brexit, the JERS figures show the economic harm of leaving the EU, and it's driving up borrowing in the UK and contributing to the UK deficit being one of the largest in Europe. Do you think, is John Swinney's analysis of the situation, particularly with regard to the impact of Brexit, do you think, is he right?
Well, I'm, as you announced earlier, based mainly in Kingston University, London. So I'm watching a lot of what goes on in Scotland from a distance. But I have a house in Edinburgh. I'm sorry I haven't been able to get back to it. So I've been very pleased to be able to get up here for the end of July, see something of the Edinburgh Festival, get a feeling for what really is going on and buzzing in Scotland. Additionally, at the beginning, I'm proud to show you a place where I have some holiday establishments here at Kinlochbervie. And I've been up the last couple of weeks getting a feel for what the issues are just on the ground. So 2 cities. I've been watching Edinburgh buzzing during the Edinburgh Fringe and Festival, and here situation developments, and actually seeing the efforts to come out of the COVID period and the economic developments, small businesses reappearing up here in Kinlochbervie. But what's clear is the tensions. My good friends who are running some of the major fringe venues actually reducing their number of events because they can't get the staffing limitations, which has absolutely been one of the issues. It's happening up here in Kinlochbervie. I remember we had people from Europe would come over from the summer, just fill these gaps. They're not here, and it's crazy. Cafes that could be doing, restaurants, hotels that could be doing business, closing early, despite all the best efforts and the regeneration. So yes, there's a lot of positive. You can see this economy that's bursting to move forward, become more, get some more efficiencies, and yet there's a restraint there. So yes, it's sad to see so much potential, so much energy in the Scottish economy, but in so many small and large ways, it's held back by so many of the Brexit issues. Kinlochbervie Harbour, we've got a great fishing port here. The export hassle, the lorries going south. I mean, we sold the shellfish that came in, the fish that came in this harbour that I'm sitting just a mile from. It was ending up on the tables in Paris, not to the same extent now. So the imagination, of course, is looking for different avenues and openings all the time. The energy and enterprise is there, but my goodness, the drag that Brexit has put on the Scottish economy, that is a tragedy, and I see it firsthand coming up here this summer. I can't believe how so many people, and it's particularly the labour issue, as well as, of course, the goods transit and export issues that are hurting us.
Absolutely. It's a good point that you make, Alan, with regard to the landings at Kinlochbervie. As I understand it, the export of shellfish, live shellfish, to the EU is effectively impossible at the moment, not least because of the import restrictions, but also because of the risks involved in having live shellfish sitting at the border in Dover waiting to get onto a ferry, and the lack of resilience in that supply chain from the perspective of the former customers in France. However, I was going to ask you also about another economic aspect of GERS and the way in which Scotland's economy is characterised by politicians and by journalists. We know that the value of a barrel of oil is now north of $100 again, and it was only a few years ago that it was down about $18 a barrel. And so much, and in contrast to the point that you're making about the importance, for example, of our fishing and agricultural industries and other industries in Scotland. So, and I'm not suggesting that oil is not very important. Self-evidently, it is. However, the way in which Scotland's economy is boiled down in a way to being no more than the value of a barrel of oil, I wondered: is that focus on the value of a single barrel of oil? Is it perhaps a way to understand maybe the naivety or the short-sightedness or the utterly transactional and idea absent approach that we get from Westminster and its puppet politicians in Scotland? Because surely what we ought to be doing is to manage the revenue from oil responsibly, and it's what we do with the revenue from oil that matters most. A sovereign oil fund, anyone? Oh no, Mrs. Thatcher spent it all on unemployment benefit.
Well, this is so true because the oil is a resource. We know that's still going to be relatively short term. Fortunately, in Scotland, we have seen superb investment in other energy resources. I mean, the offshore wind off the northwest of Scotland. And by the way, I through my energy interest, it's not just nuclear, but I got very involved in the 80s and 90s, following through the developments. Many of them pioneered in Edinburgh University, in wind, water power, all the alternatives, and we did, but not enough of an investment, and that is why it's absolutely essential that as the revenues are there is a recognition that we have to continue to thrust even further forward with using Scotland's these amazing natural resources, energy resources that Scotland has of the wind and water and even solar. I drove up to Durness, top left of Britain, right up the northwest point. And as I drove in, and it was the first time I'd driven in there for a couple of years, solar panels, it was a new housing estate, and there's the solar panels on the roof. Now, Scotland's technologies, electronics industries, all part of contributing to that. And there was investment, but not enough encouragement. So, yes, while we ride through and getting some benefits from the oil revenues, is one reason why I believe that Scotland was able to just manage its resources for itself without the tie to a global UK approach. We can just do so well, and we've got all the bases of it. Then, I mean, those of us who grew up remember about the water, the energy from the glens, and we can still return to that. But there's a spectacular energy resource success story that has been going on, and with further appropriate investment, really can see Scotland energy self-sufficient in the future, really positively so.
Thanks, Alan. That very well put. Now, before we move on to the next story, it's been pointed out to me that we've got, and I'd hoped that we could have tagged it on to the discussion about Ukraine. However, earlier today, Stuart MacDonald MP, the SNP MP for Glasgow South, tweeted that he's just been informed by the Ukrainian embassy in London that he's been awarded the Ukrainian Order of Merit by President Zelensky, and he says that that's the first time a Scottish politician has been given the honour. Do you think that recognition of Stuart MacDonald by President Zelensky and the Ukrainian...
I know Stuart so well because Stuart, and I have to say, Alan Smith as well, his colleague on the SNP front bench, you announced to our viewers that I'm chairperson of the Anglo-Belarusian Society, and I am so aware of Stuart's concern, particularly when he was dealing with some aspects of the defence portfolio, for what was happening in Belarus, and his awareness of what has been happening in the lead up to issues in Belarus and Ukraine. So, Stuart, you know they have this rule that MPs aren't meant to reply to ad hoc letters that come in about issues that the constituency MP is meant to deal with. Well, my constituency MP is actually Ed Davey. Well, I can tell you, as you respect Ed, he doesn't reply, but at least Stuart was also, as front bench and an important spokesman for SNP and House of Commons, his team would look to issues about Ukraine and Belarus I was raising, and I'm just not surprised. He has worked tirelessly and has a really, really great understanding of the Ukraine issues. And I know as one of those people that was in the background fighting to solve some of these earlier problems over the visa issues, made some really striking interventions and with a superb hands-on knowledge of the situation. And thank you, Stuart MacDonald, on behalf of both the Belarusian and Ukrainian communities that are here in Britain. That is a hugely well deserved. I didn't know about that order. I smiled as I heard it broadcast live. You heard it first here on Broadcasting Scotland.
Absolutely, Alan. We all send our congratulations to Stuart MacDonald. As he said, he's the first Scottish politician to be recognised with that award. Let's stay in Scottish politics for our next item, however, because the Deputy First Minister, John Swinney, has called for COSLA and unions to renew their efforts to find a pay settlement to resolve the refuse worker strikes, which have spread from Edinburgh to other local authorities. The Scottish Government has already allocated an additional £140 million towards increased council workers' pay settlements. COSLA agreed to raise the pay deal and offer from 3.5% to 5% last week. However, Mr Swinney regretted that the increased offer had not been made earlier when he originally made the increased funding available. Mr Swinney said that the increased offer was held up when Labour and Conservative leaders in COSLA voted against the increase. Mr Swinney encouraged COSLA and the union leaders to get back around the negotiating table and find a resolution to the strike. Mr Swinney said, "We're in an unacceptable situation just now, particularly in the city of Edinburgh, with conditions round about the waste in the city, so it's important these issues are resolved." So, Alan, do you think, is there much chance of making progress in settling this pay dispute when Tories, both red and blue, seem to be determined to play short-term political parlour games with council employees?
Well, I'm just hoping a bit of good Scottish common sense will come to bear on this and a balanced outcome. I mean, as an Edinburgh-based, Edinburgh-originating Scot, I do find it totally embarrassing that my friends in England are saying, "How is the great stink in Edinburgh?" I got that last night from somebody. What's it going? Well, as you can tell, I'm up in, unfortunately, I'm away from that. But I'm going to be going back down tomorrow. There's the end of the Edinburgh Festival. And, well, a statement had to be made. I mean, it's all this question about balance. There's a huge and important public service carried out in the recycling and waste management aspects for all our great cities for the country. So it's for those to get round a table and find that balance. And for goodness sake, you know, as a Scot, citizen of Edinburgh, I'm sure I can speak for the fact we are looking for common sense and a recognition that this isn't doing the reputation of Scotland and the city any good. You know, let's forget about all this political messing around that is going on. I don't know what they're trying to do. Again, try to spike or produce some poor reputation for the way Scotland can manage itself. But I think the citizens of Edinburgh, from all sides, and I could put out an appeal, I think we really do deserve better. So let's have one or two, another final, a good push to see if we can find that that balanced compromise, a bit of give and take on both sides, and let's hope there can be some goodwill around the table for the sake of Edinburgh and Scotland, for the other cities that I gather are poised to also experience this if there isn't some solution.
Thank you, Alan. Completely. Some goodwill and good faith, and we might see some progress here. And the local authorities would be well considered to pursue a little bit of good faith in getting these discussions to a successful conclusion. Let's move across the Atlantic now for our next item, because Donald Trump appears to have conceded in his court filing surrounding the seizure of materials from his Florida resort that he unlawfully retained official government documents, as the former president argued that some of the documents collected by the FBI could be subject to executive privilege. The motion, submitted on Monday by the former president's lawyers, argued that a court should appoint a so-called special master to separate out and determine what materials the Justice Department can review as evidence due to privilege issues. But the argument from Trump that some of the documents are subject to executive privilege protections indicates that those documents are official records that he is not authorized to keep and that he should have returned to the National Archives at the end of his administration. The motion in that regard appeared to concede that Trump violated one of the criminal statutes listed on the warrant used by the FBI to search the former president's Mar-a-Lago resort. That's 18 U.S.C. 2071, which concerns the unlawful removal of government records. If he's acknowledging that he's in possession of documents that would have any colorable claim of executive privilege, those are by definition presidential records and belong at the National Archives, said Ash Rangappa, a former FBI agent and former associate dean at Yale Law School. The search warrant for Mar-a-Lago listed obstruction for the statutes potentially violated, though it was not clear whether this was obstruction of the investigation into the very retrieval of government documents for Mar-a-Lago or for another separate investigation. Yet the section in Trump's motion titled President Donald J. Trump's Voluntary Assistance detailed the multiple steps the Justice Department took to initially retrieve 15 boxes in January, additional materials in June, and then 26 boxes when the FBI conducted its search. But despite taking custody of documents responsive to the subpoena, the Justice Department learned there may have been additional documents marked as classified and issued a subpoena on the 22nd of June demanding security camera footage of the hallway outside the storage where the materials were being kept. That subpoena for security tapes, as well as a subsequent subpoena for CCTV footage of that area from just before the FBI search on the 8th of August, suggests that the Justice Department did not think that Trump was being truthful or forthcoming in his interactions with the investigation. Those suspicions were well founded. When the government retrieved materials from Mar-a-Lago on that second collection in June, Trump's custodian of records attested they had given back all the documents responsive to the subpoena, only for the FBI to retrieve more boxes of classified materials when they returned. So, Alan, this is a live court action, and we're talking at length there about detailed American civil and criminal court practice, so I'm not going to talk to you about that this evening. We'll look at this in a slightly broader sense, if we may. Former President Trump is notorious for not reading. He was described by some of his aides earlier in his administration as being semi-literate. So for a president who doesn't read, a president who's semi-literate, what possible reason do you think he might have? And I appreciate I'm asking you to speculate here. Why would a former president who doesn't read store allegedly top secret documents in his home at Mar-a-Lago after he leaves office?
Well, as somebody who's watched and been fascinated also by American politics, and I'm sure anybody else who's watching this, it's another one of those news stories where you listen to it and you wonder, I don't remember anything quite like this happening before. We didn't hear about this when Reagan went or Clinton went or the Bushes. So what's up? What's so special? So you end up asking yourself questions. What's in there? So, I mean, without referencing specifically the case of these actual documents, and anybody reasonably would ask, what motivation would there be for any president to want to be holding on to materials? I mean, those of us in professional life can sometimes, when we move on from employment to employment, we might ask ourselves, well, are there what sort of materials that you've created, generated, would you want to hold on to? Now, there are procedures and protocols well established. There's American National Archives. If any president wants to use state official materials and documents later, perhaps for memoirs, autobiography purposes, that they're accessible. They can make due process. So it really does lead to some question, almost that, if a president is, or an individual, any situation, is wanting to remove documents, what is there in there that they specifically feel they want to hold on to and have only for themselves access to? So, trying to speak in the most general, broad terms, one really does wonder: is there a smoking gun in here? We're not hearing the detail. It's been a very blanket. Well, let's just get all these boxes. Now, by the way, it's a few years ago I did my main retirement from King's University, and I remember being in a similar panic as you're leaving, and you've got 30 years. In that case, Trump only had 4 years in the White House. But you do accumulate a mixture of personal stuff and stuff that is clearly the employer, or in his case, the state. And there might have been a degree of, well, let's just shovel it all away and we'll sort things out later. So, trying to look on a positive, what could be the motive? There may be, it may be purely that there is personal stuff in there to friends, colleagues, little memos and memoranda that he felt this is of a private, personal nature. On the other hand, there could be political issues, really some red hot. In politics, the dirty tricks brigade, what's been going on that maybe still hasn't come out. So I think, again, as an academic, keeping an open mind, there clearly could be a spectrum of reasons from something that would be along the lines that most human beings with a personal interest, if you happen to get mixed up in your papers and documents, personal material, you possibly would want to hold on to that. But I doubt if this personal material would be labeled top secret, so unless it's got in the wrong box. So it does leave you wondering what's going on. And I think this is a story that's clearly got legs on it, and I think we're going to see this run and run as a little bit more information eventually comes out, and there's a bit of sifting of these documents as to why. So I've already tried to give a couple of reasons. It's got to be there are issues in there that for political reasons, because the man is talking about maybe running again, so stuff that doesn't want coming out, or it could just be a purely personal thing and they just haven't sorted it all.
Thank you, Alan. Very elegantly put. Now, we started a little later than normal this evening, so we'll finish this evening with one more story, one more item, and that's because a commitment to ensure the long-term growth of Gaelic and Scots is at the heart of a new public consultation launched today. The consultation seeks views on how to raise the profile of Scots, a new strategic approach to Gaelic medium education, and the creation of a Gaeltacht areas with a higher percentage of Gaelic speakers. It also covers the structure and function of Bord na Gael, the principal public body promoting Gaelic in Scotland. This feedback will help developing the forthcoming Scottish Languages Bill. The 2011 census indicated that 57,375 people speak Gaelic and 87,100 said they had some Gaelic skills, and that over 1.5 million people identified them as Scots themselves as Scots speakers. Launching the consultation during a visit to the Gaelic Medium Education Unit at Goodleyburn Primary in Perth, the Education Secretary Shirley-Ann Somerville said, "Gaelic and Scots are a significant part of Scotland's culture, and we want to ensure they thrive and grow. The situation for Gaelic speakers is an improvement on 10 years ago, as there are increased numbers in Gaelic medium education and more initiatives in place to support Gaelic in Scotland. Scots is spoken throughout Scotland, but has never benefited from formal support through legislation, and it may be time to consider this to help promote, strengthen and raise the profile of the language." So, Alan, fairly briefly, if we can, Shirley-Ann Somerville said that Scots is spoken throughout Scotland, but has never benefited from formal support. I'd go a little bit further than that. I would suggest that in much of central Scotland for much of the last century, it was belted out of children if they had the temerity to speak in Scots. So do you think, are we seeing a turning now in terms of, and in fact, you may remember from your own education, a view taken in schools in Edinburgh as to children speaking in Scots. More generally, though, do you think, are we turning a corner now in terms of the recognition and the support of both Gaelic and Scots as part of our culture, and also in terms of raising a cohort of young people who are bilingual and benefit from that?
Well, it's another thing I've seen, this point you made about the recognition, particularly of Gaelic up here in the north. You notice things like there's more road signs around that are bilingual. So it is on the up. Yes, as a young lad from Edinburgh, well, we had our Robbie Burns, but it was almost, Scots was as a peripheral. It was just like another second language, or even a third one after French. You had to speak your clear, received English. But I think we were really quite proud that we could work our way through the poems of Robbie Burns, and I think perhaps what is maybe needed is much more in the curriculum, a wider range of Scots authors, poets, and appreciation. It's a beautiful, expressive language, and something we can all be proud of, and maybe use to slip in a little bit in our international activities. In fact, one thing I always found that if you deal with things, and we've had a lot of reference to Ukraine and Belarus, but people in East Europe really do appreciate the local cultures and something that is not pure spoken English. And quite a few Ukrainians can recite their Robbie Burns when they go up to it. I get asked a few questions about Scots words and the different dialects and accents. A few Aberdonians are much stronger on this sort of thing than we are in Edinburgh.
Absolutely.
Great to see us moving in the right direction.
Absolutely. Thanks, Alan. And that is all that we have time for this evening. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our approach to news, current affairs and culture. Please help us to continue to make these programmes, to develop the station, and to make new programmes for you. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We have set ourselves a target of adding 10,000 new subscribers to enable us to employ staff to make more programmes. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. Meantime, we will be here again tomorrow with the next edition of Scotland at 7, so please tune in and join us again then. And that's the way it is at a little past Scotland at 8. I'd like to thank everyone who's been watching this evening, and I'd like to give very special thanks to our very special guest and Kinlochbervie correspondent, Dr. Alan Flowers. Thanks, Alan.
Thank you.
On this day in 1879, we witnessed the birth in Pollokshaws of John Maclean, the revolutionary socialist politician who played an important part in the Red Clydeside movement and who most Scots would consider a legend. He died in 1923 at the age of 44 after long periods of imprisonment, hunger strikes and force feeding. Maclean collapsed while giving an outdoor speech and died of pneumonia. Several days before, he had given his only overcoat to a destitute man from Barbados called Neil Johnson. I wonder just how fast Mr. Maclean is burrowing in his grave at Eastwood New Cemetery in Thornley Bank now. Have a very peaceful evening. Bye-bye.